Hey everyone, welcome to Keto and Crime. If you were watching this when it first launches, it is May 13th, Monday. I am going over what happened on Friday, May 10th in the Chad Daybell trial. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Tracy. I run this channel. I do true crime, horror movie reviews, dark history. I have extensively covered the 𝗬𝗏𝗪 case. There's over 150 videos on my channel, including reviews of Chad Daybell's books. So I am trying to take each day of the trial and condense it into a very digestible block of information. Just take the high points. I also do a holiday tree, which is currently stuck on 𝗪𝗂 de Mayo. That will change soon. But with that being said, let's dive right in, shall we? So when court first comes to order, we our first witness of the day being called by Lindsay Blake for the prosecution is former Fremont County Deputy Coroner Crammy Wilmore. She became deputy coroner in March of 2019. She worked with Brenda Dye, who we've already heard from. She is no longer a deputy coroner, but she was a paramedic for over 15 years, so she does have some medical experiences. She responded. She was one of the assistant coroners that Brenda Dye sent out to the Daybell residence on the day of Tammy's death on October 9th, 2019. She had responded to only about 5 to 6 unattended deaths up to that point, as she was new in her position, and she did not know Chad or Tammy. She said that she first saw Garth, who seemed a little distraught. Then she spoke to Chad, and we know the story that Chad told everybody, and then she went on into the bedroom to investigate Tammy's death, and eventually Garth came in there as well, said he was still very distraught, as you would be. She said she spoke with Chad about Tammy's health history, what might have happened. She asked if he had any medical issues, and of course said that she had been lightheaded and hypotensive in the last month, that she had been a bit clumsy, that she was menopausal, so she slept with one leg out of the covers, and he heard her when she rolled off the bed, and that she had gotten up and vomited during the night. She did a cursory examination of the body and noticed that she was stiff. Rigor mortis was starting to set in. She said probably because of the time of death. She took the sheet down, looked at her face and neck. She noticed some bruising on her bicep, but Chad had just told her she was clumsy, so she said it looked older, so she didn't give it much mind. Then she noticed the pink foam coming from her mouth, and she said she had never seen anything like this before, so she basically called Brenda Dye for more support to come out, and so she didn't do anything with the body until Brenda Dye arrived. Wilmore arrived at the house about 6:35, 6:40 a.m. She said the Daybell home was about 6 miles away from her home, and she came directly from home, and it was obvious Tammy had been dead a few hours. There was not a lot of bruising, and as we all know, a medical examiner has already ruled that it was the inexperience of the Fremont County Coroner's Department was one of the main reasons that no autopsy was done. Then they show some of the photos that she took of the bedroom. There's a white towel on the floor, and she said she used that to clean up the floor from some of the white foam. She said that she didn't find anything that, just screamed poisoning either in the house or by virtue of Tammy's condition. She said that Chad never mentioned seizures or fainting spells to her. She said she had been lightheaded, but no actual fainting. And she said that no medications that were found inside the home stood out to her as anything conclusive of a major medical problem or that could have been used as poison. And she said she never heard of J.J. Ryan, Tylee, Lori, or Alex Cox before then. And Blake tenders the witness, Pryor cross-examines. He asked more about Wilmore, mentioning that Tammy had been clumsy. She just said she had been lightheaded and had stumbled around a little bit. And then they look at a picture that showed some of the stuff on Tammy's nightstand. There was essential oils, herbs, homeopathic remedies, and she said there was a few of those still in the medicine cabinet as well. And then Pryor asked if other members of the Daybell family were present when she and Dye spoke with him about having an autopsy. She said that she doesn't really remember, but that Chad was adamant that he did not want an autopsy, and because there were no apparent signs of foul play, they did not order one. He did mention the lightheadedness several times and may have mentioned fainting to die, but Wilmore said he never said fainting to her. And then Pryor asked about the bruises, and she said there was maybe 3 total, and they were not enough to consider suspicious as they looked to be older. And then Pryor asked if someone has a heavy lung, would there be foaming at the mouth? Wilmore said that she knew about heart issues that might cause foaming, but she didn't know enough about what would cause it. Pryor is done. Blake does a little bit of a redirect. She asked Wilmore if she ever looked at the prescription medication. She said she doesn't recall seeing any, and Wilmore did not have the benefit of reviewing medical records and was going on information only provided by Chad. She said she can't be 100% sure if whether a bruise is old or new simply by looking at it, that would have to be determined by the autopsy. And as we've already heard from the actual medical examiner that did the autopsy, that they were fresh bruises, not old ones. Blake then asks if asphyxiation could cause foam, and Wilmore says yes. And then there are no further questions. Wilmore is released from her subpoena. The next witness is 𝗙𝗪𝗍𝗻𝗄. This is Tammy's brother-in-law. He's married to her sister Samantha, and 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗀𝗀 will be questioning him. Jason worked with Chad. They lived near each other for about 4 years. They were pretty close before this case. Jason said he married Samantha in 1995. Jason and his family would see Chad and his family at least once or twice a week. Jason and Chad saw each other up to 4 to 5 times a week. They went to the same church, and they had shared hobbies, and they said they worked very close together for about 6 months before Chad moved up to Idaho. He said he felt that he was very close to Chad. Chad says that he and Chad would talk about different issues about family, religion, just about anything, and I feel like he said, I feel like we had some really deep conversations on a number of things, as friends and brother-in-laws would tend to do. Wixom asked if there was anything specific in his discussions with Chad where Chad shared concern about his relationship with Tammy. He said that really the only thing that could be construed as a complaint was that he said it was just a little vanilla. He said that it was just almost as if they were just going through the motions. Jason said Chad shared an experience about being in water in La Jolla, California, where he was beat up with some rocks, and his famous cliff jumping episode where he had his near-death experience and what kind of put him on his hyper-focus on religion path. And then they talked more about those near-death experiences and how he started having visions of what he said was the final days, the earthquakes, destruction, invading troops from other countries. If you've heard any of my summaries of Chad's books, there's all of that stuff is in there. I'll link those playlists right up there. And how he became hyper-focused on that. He said that Chad would often use that to try to convert Jason to his way of thinking, and he really felt that Utah was going to be torn apart by all of this and felt that Rexburg would be a city of light and refuge, and he really tried to convince Jason and Samantha to move there. He said originally he thought some of Chad's visions might be reasonable, but then it started to get more out there, and then he and Samantha pretty much refused to move to Idaho. Chad wrote Jason a letter in 2016 and basically told him, you need to be in Idaho. There would be a huge earthquake within 3 years, and he and Samantha's house would be destroyed. Chad told Jason that the dark spirits would allow Samantha to go south, but she would not come to Idaho. So basically setting Samantha, we all know that Samantha had issues with Chad. So again, that whole thing about anybody that I don't like is dark, or doesn't like me is dark. And that Chad told Jason that the dark spirits would basically take over his wife. And Jason said that pissed him off. That he said, I'm the head of my household. Chad doesn't need to worry about my household. So then you got some dueling machismo there. He said that he really felt Chad was trying to control his family and basically told Chad in a nice way to F off. And then they did go visit them a couple of times. He showed Jason around Rexburg and BYU, Idaho, and said this would be a nice city, and that there would be tent cities, and he would expand his property and turn it into a tent city. He said after that visit, he felt that something in his psyche was telling him, you don't need to be there, and that this is not a good place for you. And then Jason told Chad he would not be coming up, but he did talk about Tammy, about how much he liked her. She was a kind and gentle person, and she had a lot of people's best interests at heart. He said that Tammy was not thrilled about the Idaho move. She loved being around her extended family, and her and Samantha were very close. She was happy in Springville, and she had all of her family there. But she said she was continually feeling isolated in Rexburg, even though she easily made friends. During the last year of Tammy's life, Jason says they saw each other at a Christmas party in 2018, and that, there was nothing really unusual. She said that her and Chad were not engaging together in conversation. It was more like they were split apart. So in his opinion, there was some sort of rift forming. And then he said that when he found out Tammy was died, like everyone else, he was shocked. And he and Samantha, ran down there to see what had happened. They arrived around noonish on the day Tammy died. He said he spoke with Chad, and they just discussed getting in touch with a mortician, the church, setting up a funeral in Utah with burial and a memorial service there in Idaho. But he said that Chad did want the funeral. Now, that she died on a Saturday, that Chad wanted the funeral Monday or Tuesday. So Jason said he felt that it was very, very rushed. And then, of course, he told her the entire story. Then Jason went back up with Steve Schultz, the mortician from Springville, to pick up Tammy's body. And then, they pretty much the same story we've heard about the funeral and the burial, and the Chad's attitude, where he basically told everybody he was all cried out. Jason did mention that it looked to him like that Chad would tear up at the proper moments. So, he said that during the funeral, he was watching one of Chad's grandchildren in the back. Jason didn't get to observe as much as he would like, but he did say that Chad didn't arrive to the luncheon that the church held for them until 45 minutes into it. He said that he and the kids needed to get back to Rexburg for the memorial, and basically took off right after the funeral. And then a month after the funeral, Jason reached out to Chad to see how he was doing. Chad asked if Jason had been speaking to Heather Daybell, his sister-in-law, the other sister that hated Chad, married to Matt, or his sister-in-law married to his brother, not Tammy's sister. He said that Jason was not close to Heather, but that Chad asked him if Heather Daybell had been spreading rumors about them, and Jason said, I don't really talk to Heather, so I wouldn't know. But he had not heard anything. And then he said he was very surprised to hear that Chad had gotten married. It was not common to marry someone within a month of a spouse that you've been married to almost 30 years. And then he started asking who Lori was, and he said there was no mention of JJ or Tylee, just said that she had some grown children. And then another time they spoke, he confirmed that he had not told Tammy's parents that he had remarried, so Jason had to call and break the news to them. And he was surprised that none of the Daybell children had told him. And he basically said, Chad said that my kids are good at keeping secrets. And then the next contact Jason had with Chad was the day that they exhumed Tammy's body. And Chad texted and said he needed to talk with them, and that he called Samantha. They put it on speaker, and Chad asked Samantha and Jason if they knew Tammy had been exhumed and if they were responsible for it. And they said, we have no idea why she's being exhumed. We didn't mention anything to anybody. And then they started talking about the history of law enforcement in this case between the three of them. Then there's a short recess. We come back. Some continues questioning Jason. And he tells, we play a phone call between him and Chad and Samantha, and they kind of break down that conversation. And there's quite a bit of arguing back and forth between Tammy, Samantha, between Samantha, Jason, and Chad basically is getting very heated. And then when they started talking to police, Chad got very angry with them. And basically their relationship kind of ended. In a few other conversations, they talk about Jason asked if Chad's kids had plans for Christmas. They did discuss their Christmas plans. And then they talk about the autopsy they're going to do on Tammy and what might come from that. And then Chad asked Jason if he and Sam are coming to Idaho for Christmas, and he says they're not coming. And then the phone call kind of disconnects. He said he never had any other phone calls, missed or otherwise, from Chad that he recalls prior now. And then the next time is when he hears that the children's bodies have been found. And then 𝗏𝗏 says he has no further questions, and Pryor now begins to cross-examine. He asks him about their close relationship, about the church, about doctrine, and then about how Chad was censored by the church, and basically Tammy's involvement in the publishing company. He said that what we already know, that Tammy was the business end of it. She did everything but find the writers and write the books herself. And basically about how he found out about Lori, basically just trying to go over and then talk about how sick Tammy was. And Jason says, I have no idea. Tammy was always seemed to be healthy to me. He then asked him about the history with 𝗙𝗏𝗃, the mortician that took the body from Idaho to Utah for burial, and that kind of asked him about his credentials and what he said. And he said, all I know is that Steve is good at what he does. He's a good man, and he did not lie or do anything. So Pryor's trying to paint this whole conspiracy, I think, that Tammy's family and friends hated Chad. And then they go back talking about visions and the LDS faith, and he said it's not unusual, but the kind of visions Chad was having were very unusual. Pryor has nothing further. 𝗏𝗏 now redirects. He asked Jason if he's concerned that he wasn't informed prior to Tammy's exhumation. Jason said he would have liked to have known because it was his wife's sister, but he's not concerned that he wasn't. And then 𝗏𝗏 asked Jason how many law enforcement contacts he has had regarding Chad. He said since Tammy was exhumed, at least 20, but he doesn't know an exact number. 𝗏𝗏 asked him if law enforcement has ever tried to influence what he would say. He says no, he just answers their questions. And that then 𝗏𝗏 asked, did Chad or Lori in the conversations you had with her ever seem to be overly concerned about the children? He says no, they just said the children were safe. And then he asked about Chad's book publishing company. He said there was one author that he was particularly concerned with, except for, Chad himself. And I think we all know that's probably Julie Rowe, the more outlandish. And that Tammy did have some concerns about what they were putting out. And that 𝗏𝗏 then asked if Tylee and JJ were just a simple situation. Pryor had tried to allude that Chad did not know they were buried there, and it was just a simple case of them putting the bodies there. But 𝗏𝗏 now says, does that seem two dead bodies in somebody's property? Does that seem to be a simple situation? And Jason said that's about as far from simple as you can get. Pryor will now redirect, and he basically comes back at Jason where Chad had basically called it a simple situation, and Pryor suggests it was just a custody matter, and that may have been why Chad was involved. Jason says, I have no idea. I just know what he told me, that was a simple situation. And so Pryor is done. Lindsay Blake will now call Samantha, which is Jason's wife and Tammy's sister. Basically, he goes through her history with Tammy, how close they were, and then he goes over her knowledge of the Daybell property in Rexburg. And she says that the first exhibit shows a photo of Chad's property. They're showing some pictures, and that she's describing the fire pit, the pond, the pet cemetery, all of that good stuff. And then they talk about Tammy some more. They list off all their children, and as well as her family, her immediate family. She said there were 3 boys and 2 girls. Tammy was the second oldest, and there were 4 years between her and Tammy. They were the best of friends. They had a great friendship while everybody lived in Utah, and everybody was thriving. She then asked about Chad's employment history and said that they did do the publishing company, but mainly he brought in money by being a sexton or a grave digger. And then when Chad told her that he had the vision, they should move to Idaho, Samantha was concerned, and she talked to Tammy, and Tammy said it made her very unhappy to have to leave her family. But she said that she had seen Tammy, or talked to Tammy about 2 weeks before she died. She was doing fine. She was talking about all of her dance and exercise classes, and that she was even talking about taking some stage combat at a local theater school. So Tammy was not short of breath nor having any medical issues that Samantha knew about. She said she was, perimenopausal, as we all are. I am right now too. And that she never had any adverse reactions to any homeopathic medicines, and that had just been something their mother had always had them do, was to take natural remedies to help prevent things. And then she said that that visit where she saw Tammy about 2 weeks before she died was kind of impromptu, when she texted Tammy and Tammy asked her if she'd be around, that she would be around for an impromptu visit. They saw each other. She traveled alone back to Utah for that last visit. She said that was very unusual. She didn't like to drive long distances, but she came. She said Tammy never gave any indication that Chad was having an affair. There were any problems in their marriage. Any dissatisfaction with the marriage seemed to be coming from Chad, and that it seemed to be impromptu, and that the last time she saw Chad and Tammy, Chad remained in a van while Tammy came in to talk to them. She'd seen her approximately, 3 times before she died, the last time being 2 weeks prior. And she talked about a conversation she had with Chad over the phone after Tammy died. He asked if he was going to do an autopsy, and he said no. He would just like to get the funeral done quickly. And then they talked about that Tammy was transported by her husband and the mortician from Rexburg to Springville, and that she just thought it was very, very unusual that Chad did not want an autopsy. And he was complaining more about it holding up the funeral and it being a $1,500 cost rather than trying to find out what killed his wife. And then she said about a month after Tammy died, she and Jason reached out to Chad. Then that's when she first heard about Lori Ryan and that they had lost a spouse, and that's when they met up. She said that she got a really bad feeling, and she just felt that Chad probably had to know her long before, he married her. And then that's when she called, after they hung up from that initial call, she called Chad back and says, "Please tell me about this woman you've replaced my sister with." And then they asked about the name difference, Ryan versus Vallow. Chad said Lori had a complicated past and wanted to move on. And then we go into Chad telling Samantha that Tammy visited her at the cemetery and told him that he needed to move on. So now he's saying that his wife came back and said, "Yes, go ahead and get married." And she got mad and said, "You know what? I know my sister would have wanted you to be happy and move on. I don't believe this whole vision thing. But moving on quickly means within a year or two, not 2 weeks or a month after they died." Blake has no further questions. Then they go a break for lunch. And then Pryor is back with his cross-examination of Samantha. He asked if she remembers how many times she'd been interviewed as part of the investigation. She says a handful of times. He's still on this bender that law enforcement is planting ideas into everyone's head about Chad. I mean, he wants it all wrapped up in this neat little package that Lori did all of this, and Chad was just somehow a dummy that just let it all happen to him. And then he specifically asked about when she met with law enforcement in June of 2020. She lists off the officers that were there, Hermosillo, Ball, and Rob Wood, and that her husband was also there. And then Lindsay Blake objects and approaches the stand. They take about a 10-minute sidebar in the judge's chambers. And then they go back to, they kind of drop that whole June thing, and they spring forward to a law enforcement meeting that Jason and Samantha had in December of 2020. And then Pryor asks about the animals in the pet cemetery, and Samantha says she did not know all of the pets that were there, that Tammy would often just bury random animals there because Tammy was an animal lover. And then Pryor asked her if it was Tammy's primary responsibility to care for the pet cemetery. She says she doesn't know. She's sure they all helped with it. Then they talk about how Tammy was the primary business manager of the publishing company, and that Samantha agrees with that, said yes, she did everything but write the books and find the authors. And then Pryor asked if Tammy was a good mother. She said she was an excellent mother. And then he goes on to talking about how she was having wrist pain and was going to bed early at such a young age, and was just not feeling well. Samantha said she had no indication of that, as she said she saw her sister 2 weeks before she died, and she was perfectly healthy and even drove to Utah herself. And then they show another picture of Chad's property. Again, Samantha points out all the major points of interest, and then some pictures in the house. She points out the cozy cone, and that a couple of raspberry patches that they had. And then Pryor has no further questions. Blake does a quick redirect. He asks Samantha why she hasn't been in contact with Chad's kids. She says she has attempted to contact the children, but they will not return her calls or texts. And then Blake asks if at some point Samantha knew of something else buried in Chad's backyard. And then she says yes, and she starts to cry and says yes, 2 children. And then Blake has nothing further. The state now calls or recalls FBI tactical specialist Nicole Heidman to the stand. She had previously testified back in April. There's a brief sidebar, and some of the jurors, not the jurors, but some people in the gallery, including Samantha and Ben, who is another of Tammy's siblings, and is crying. They step out for a minute and then eventually come back in. Blake asks Heidemann about why she's, what they're talking about now that she's back on the stand. She said she was asked to look for evidence of the wedding planning between Chad and Lori. And then they talk about how they got most of that from the Lori for Style iCloud account, and that there were the famous romance novel. They bring that up, the Malachite rings, all of the preparations, the travel plans back and forth to Hawaii, who purchased the tickets, and that some things purchased on Etsy as well. And then talking about how one wedding band that was purchased was 11.5, purchased on October 2nd. It was returned, and a new size 11 was purchased. And that all of that happened while Tammy was still alive. And then again, they had to send that size 11 back and purchase a 10 again. Tammy's still alive while all this shenanigans was going on. It's very good what the prosecution's doing here. They're showing that this shows premeditation, that Tammy's death was premeditated, as was the wedding. And then they talk about a text message from Chad to one of Lori's phones in July of 2019, 2 days after Charles died. He talks about the upcoming graduation of Chad's kids and how he feels that Tammy will be gone before then. Then we see a bunch of text about Chad and Lori regarding Kauai and the elopement, and then they tell each other how much they love each other. And then they look at attendance records where Chad and Lori attended temple together. And then how they went to the Gilbert Temple, the Idaho Falls Temple, and a Houston Temple at some point during 2019. And then they enter the famous romance novel, which I have reviewed, the James and Elena story. It's right up there. And that was found in several 𝗘𝗏 accounts. And they talk about all the exhibits and how they were very passionate for each other. This all started when they first met in October of 2018. They showed how fast this proceeded. And then they talk about the timeline of the novel versus the timeline of the conference, and how Lori and Chad met. Then they talk about the novel within the novel, The Renewed Earth, which is one of Chad Daybell's books that I actually reviewed and summarized. You'll find it in this playlist. How that is also mentioned in the romance novel, and how they were married in a previous lifetime. So all of this is basically showing a lot of premeditation, that they were intending to get married and be together no matter if they had living spouses or not. Then we talk about more travel plans and who paid for what. And basically then we're done for the day, and Heidemann will be back on the stand today, May 13th, Monday, and I will be back tomorrow, Tuesday, May 14th, with more of the Chad Daybell trial. And until next time, keep don't cry.